The United States of America was born not in certainty, but in fragility. In 1775, when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, the 13 colonies that would one day form a nation were nothing more than scattered settlements along the eastern seaboard. They were farmers, merchants, fishermen, and artisans, united less by shared culture than by shared resentment of Britain's growing grip. The American Revolution did not begin as a war that America was destined to win. In fact, by nearly every measure, wealth, numbers, training, supplies, global power, the odds were stacked against the colonists. The British Empire had one of the largest and best-equipped militaries in the world. Its navy dominated the seas, and its army was seasoned and disciplined. The American colonies, by contrast, had militias that were often poorly armed and untrained, relying on muskets passed down from father to son and supplies that were difficult to come by for much of the war. The prospect of collapse was real. Entire campaigns ended in disaster for the revolutionaries. The British captured New York in 1776, forcing George Washington's Continental Army to retreat across New Jersey in a bitter winter march. Many thought the rebellion would collapse then and there. Washington himself admitted, privately, that the situation seemed hopeless. Men deserted in droves, hungry, cold, and fearful. Supplies were so scarce that some soldiers marched barefoot, leaving bloody prints in the snow. And yet this moment of near collapse became a crucible. Washington, with remarkable determination, crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night of 1776, leading a surprise attack at Trenton. It was a small victory in terms of numbers, but it was a lifeline for morale. The revolution staggered forward. But the darkest moment came at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 to 1778. Washington's men encamped in Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia, which at the time was occupied by the British. The winter was brutal. Food was scarce, shelter was inadequate, and disease ravaged the camp. Around 2,000 soldiers died from cold, hunger, or illness. Letters from the time describe scenes of men wrapped in rags, desperately boiling leather for sustenance or huddling together in makeshift huts to share warmth. This was America at the edge of collapse. Had the army dissolved there, the revolution may have ended. And yet, something extraordinary happened. Out of this suffering, discipline and resolve were forged. With the help of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who drilled the men in modern tactics, the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge leaner, harder, and more organized. The survival of the army, against all odds, kept the dream of independence alive. The war dragged on for years, with setbacks and near disasters, including the betrayal of Benedict Arnold, once one of America's celebrated generals. But in 1781, when Washington and his allies trapped British General Cornwallis at Yorktown, the revolution turned decisively. French ships blockaded the British, and American and French troops surrounded them on land. Cornwallis surrendered. The United States was free, but freedom had been bought at the razor's edge of collapse. America's birth was not inevitable. It was uncertain, fragile, and almost lost to despair before it even began. Barely 3 decades after winning independence, the United States once again found itself at war with its former colonial master. The War of 1812 is often remembered as America's second war of independence, but at the time, it was a war that nearly destroyed the fragile republic. The causes were layered. Britain, still engaged in a titanic struggle against Napoleon's France, imposed harsh restrictions on American trade. British warships stopped American vessels, seized cargo, and, most insultingly, impressed American sailors into the Royal Navy. In the eyes of many Americans, Britain treated them as rebellious children rather than as a sovereign nation. War was declared in June 1812. Yet the United States was woefully unprepared. Its standing army was small and poorly trained, its navy minuscule compared to Britain's world-dominating fleet. The government was fractured. New England states, heavily dependent on trade, opposed the war entirely, while war hawks in Congress clamored for expansion into Canada. The early campaigns were disastrous. American attempts to invade Canada ended in humiliating defeat. The British, commanding the seas, blockaded ports and strangled commerce. By 1814, the war had turned into a desperate struggle for survival, and then came the darkest day. In August 1814, British forces landed in Maryland and marched toward Washington, D.C. At the Battle of Bladensburg, American troops, poorly organized and led, broke and ran. President James Madison himself was present on the battlefield, but even he was powerless to stop the collapse. With the capital defenseless, British soldiers entered Washington. What followed was one of the most searing images in American history. The invaders set fire to the city's public buildings, the Capitol, the Treasury, and, most famously, the President's mansion. Flames engulfed the White House, sending an eerie glow into the night sky. First Lady Dolly Madison, before fleeing, rescued a portrait of George Washington that might otherwise have been lost. For many, this moment symbolized America's fragility. The very heart of government lay in ashes. Rumors spread that the entire republic might crumble, that the experiment of self-rule had failed. Across the Atlantic, some British commentators mocked the Americans as foolish upstarts who would soon come crawling back to the crown. And yet, America did not collapse. Days after the burning, a sudden and violent thunderstorm swept through the Capitol, extinguishing the flames before the city was entirely destroyed. Some said it was divine providence. Others simply saw it as fortune. The war dragged on, but resilience emerged. In Baltimore, at Fort McHenry, American defenders withstood a massive British naval bombardment. From that battle, Francis Scott Key composed the words that would become the Star-Spangled Banner, a testament to survival. Under fire, finally, in 1815, news of peace arrived. The Treaty of Ghent ended the conflict, and though it resolved few of the original issues, it left the United States standing. In fact, the stunning American victory at the Battle of New Orleans fought after the treaty was signed, but before. Word reached the continent, gave the war a triumphant ending in public memory. Yet for those who lived through it, the War of 1812 was another brush with collapse. The burning of Washington was not simply an attack on a city, it was a symbolic attempt to snuff out the young nation. That the United States endured spoke not to its invincibility, but to its stubborn resilience. Twice in less than half a century, America had survived when survival seemed nearly impossible. Asterisk by the middle of the 19th century, America once again stood on the edge of collapse, this time not because of foreign invasion, but because of division from within. The question of slavery, festering since the nation's founding, had become an unbridgeable gulf. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Southern leaders saw it as a direct threat to their way of life. One by one, Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. By April 1861, Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, igniting the Civil War. It was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Brothers fought against brothers, states against states, the Union itself fractured by hatred and fear. More than 600,000 would perish before it was over. And throughout much of the war, collapse seemed not just possible, but likely at first. The Confederacy seemed to have the upper hand. Its generals, Robert E. Lee chief among them, outmaneuvered Union armies again and again. The South fought with determination, believing its survival was at stake. Meanwhile, Northern unity wavered. Some called for peace, arguing that the Union should simply let the South go. The possibility of America permanently splitting in two loomed large. The turning point came in July 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, the quiet farmland became a killing field. Lee had invaded the North, hoping to win a decisive victory on Union soil that might force Lincoln to negotiate peace. Instead, the two armies clashed in the largest battle ever fought on American soil. On the first day, Confederate forces pushed Union troops back through the town of Gettysburg, gaining ground. On the second day, Lee hurled his men against the Union flanks at places like Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand, and the outcome hung by a thread. On the third day, Lee made a desperate gamble. He ordered what became known as Pickett's Charge, nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers marching across open fields toward the center of the Union line. It was a tragic sight, men advancing shoulder to shoulder under withering artillery and rifle fire. Few reached the Union lines. Most fell long before. The Confederate Army was shattered. Gettysburg did not end the war, but it broke the South's momentum. From that point on, the Confederacy fought defensively, slowly bleeding under the relentless pressure of Union armies. Later that year, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. In just a few brief words, he reframed the war. It was not simply about preserving the Union, but about ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Still, collapse remained a constant threat. The war dragged into 1864, casualties mounted, and Lincoln faced re-election. Had he lost, the new president might have sought peace with the Confederacy. Instead, battlefield victories, most notably General Sherman's capture of Atlanta, revived Northern morale. In April 1865, Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was saved. But the cost was staggering. Entire cities in ruins, families torn apart, hundreds of thousands dead. Lincoln himself would not live to see the nation healed, assassinated just days after the war's end. The Civil War remains the closest America has ever come to true collapse. It was not simply a battle for territory, but for the soul of the nation. At Gettysburg and beyond, the question hung in the air. Could a republic divided by such bitter lines survive? The answer, paid for in blood, was yes. But survival came at a price America still grapples with today. Asterisk on the quiet. Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, the United States still believed it had time. While war raged in Europe and Asia, America had clung to its tradition of isolation, debating how, or if, it should become involved. Many Americans wanted no part of another world war. Others, watching Nazi Germany sweep across Europe, argued that intervention was inevitable. That morning, the debate ended. Just before 8 a.m., waves of Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was left in ruins, battleships burned. Aircraft were shredded on the ground. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. Smoke billowed into the sky as stunned sailors and civilians tried to make sense of the devastation. The shock was total. For the first time since the War of 1812, America had been attacked on its own soil. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. War was declared, and America found itself thrust into the most brutal conflict in human history. The months that followed were grim. The Japanese expanded across the Pacific, conquering the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. American troops in the Philippines endured the Bataan Death March, a harrowing journey of starvation and abuse. In Europe, Hitler's armies still seemed unstoppable. America faced a terrifying reality: the possibility of fighting a two-front war against two of the world's greatest military powers. Collapse was not only possible, some feared it was likely. Yet the United States mobilized with astonishing speed. Factories that had once built cars now produced tanks and aircraft. Millions of young men enlisted. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. The road to victory, however, was long and uncertain. Battles in the Pacific, Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima were fought island by island, each one a bloody struggle. In Europe, the turning point came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. That morning, thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. The ocean churned with landing craft. Machine gun fire raked the sand. Many never made it past the waterline. But inch by inch, the Allies pushed inland. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and its success marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Still, the war's most devastating moment of near collapse came not in Europe, but in the Pacific. By 1945, Japan, though battered, refused to surrender. American military planners warned that an invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost 1 million Allied lives. Faced with this prospect, the United States turned to a weapon unlike any seen before: the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima vanished in a blinding flash. 3 days later, Nagasaki met the same fate. Entire cities were reduced to ash, and tens of thousands perished instantly. It was the most terrifying demonstration of destructive power the world had ever seen. Within days, Japan surrendered. World War II was over for America. Victory came at a terrible price: more than 400,000 dead, countless wounded, and the birth of a new era where human civilization itself could be annihilated in moments. Yet the war also reshaped America into a global superpower. No longer isolated, it now bore the responsibility of leadership and the burden of preventing another collapse. This time on a global scale. By the 1960s, America was no stranger to war. But Vietnam would prove unlike any conflict the nation had ever faced. It was not a war of clear battle lines or decisive victories, but of jungles, insurgencies, and a creeping uncertainty that would tear at the very fabric of American society. The roots of the conflict stretched back to the end of World War II, when colonial powers and independence movements clashed across Asia. Vietnam, long under French rule, became a battlefield between communist revolutionaries, led by Ho Chi Minh, and Western-backed forces. When France withdrew after defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the United States stepped in, determined to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. At first, American involvement was limited to advisors and financial support, but by the mid-1960s, U.S. combat troops poured into the region. President Lyndon B. Johnson escalated the war dramatically after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, when alleged attacks on U.S. ships gave Washington justification for deeper involvement. Yet, from the beginning, the war was a paradox. On paper, America was the most powerful nation on Earth, with unmatched technology, air power, and resources. But in the dense jungles of Vietnam, firepower alone did not guarantee victory. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army fought a guerrilla war, using ambushes, traps, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The enemy could be anywhere and nowhere. American soldiers endured heat, exhaustion, and fear, in a landscape where friend and foe often blurred. Villages might shelter Viet Cong fighters by night, even as they welcomed American patrols by day. The constant threat of ambush bred mistrust and trauma. At home, the war became increasingly controversial. Images of burning villages, napalm strikes, and body bags returning from overseas filled television screens. The war was the first to be broadcast directly into American living rooms, and the images were devastating. Many began to ask, what was America fighting for? The Tet Offensive of 1968 was the breaking point. On the Vietnamese New Year, Communist forces launched a massive Tet-coordinated assault on cities and bases across South Vietnam. Militarily, the U.S. and its allies repelled the offensive, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. But psychologically, it was a catastrophe. The American public, told for years that victory was near, now saw the enemy's resilience and reach. Confidence collapsed. Protests exploded across the United States. College campuses erupted with demonstrations. Draft cards burned. Some young Americans fled to Canada to avoid conscription. The nation was divided as never before since the Civil War. Year after year, presidents promised progress. Year after year, the war dragged on. The body count grew, while trust in government dwindled. The phrase credibility gap entered the national vocabulary, describing the chasm between official reports and the grim reality. Finally, in 1973, American combat troops withdrew under the Paris Peace Accords. 2 years later, in April 1975, the North Vietnamese launched their final offensive. South Vietnam crumbled. The last haunting image of the war was captured in Saigon. Helicopters lifting desperate evacuees from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy as communist forces closed in. Crowds surged, begging for escape. Many were left behind. Within hours, Saigon fell. The war was over. For America, Vietnam was more than a military defeat. It was a collapse of confidence in government, in foreign policy, in the very notion of America's role in the world. The nation had poured immense resources into the conflict, sacrificed more than 58,000 lives, and still failed to achieve its aims. The war left scars that remain visible today: mistrust of government, caution toward foreign interventions, and a lingering sense of disillusionment. Vietnam was not the collapse of the United States as a nation, but it was a collapse of belief, a moment when America stood uncertain of its own identity and purpose. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Americans awoke to an ordinary Tuesday. The sun rose over New York City. Commuters filled the subways, and office towers buzzed with the rhythms of daily life. Within hours, that normalcy was gone, replaced by horror that shook the very foundations of the United States. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. Television cameras, already fixed on the smoking North Tower, broadcast the second impact live to millions. It was the moment America realized this was no accident. It was war. By 9:37 a.m., a third plane hit the Pentagon, the heart of America's military power. A fourth, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a Pennsylvania field after passengers heroically fought back against the hijackers. Its intended target may have been the Capitol or the White House in New York. The towers burned for less than 2 hours before collapsing into dust and steel, raining ash across lower Manhattan. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. Firefighters, police officers, and ordinary civilians risked and gave their lives in frantic attempts to save others. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans felt their homeland under direct attack, but this time the enemy was shadowy, diffuse, and unseen. President George W. Bush, addressing the nation that night, promised that America would not falter. But many wondered if the nation could recover from the trauma. The economy shuddered. Fear gripped the airwaves. Airports transformed overnight. Security intensified, and words like terrorism and homeland security became fixtures in daily conversation Within weeks, America launched a war in Afghanistan to topple the Taliban regime that had sheltered al-Qaeda. The war began swiftly, with U.S. airstrikes and special forces supporting Afghan allies. Kabul fell quickly. It seemed, at first, that America had regained control, but the war did not end. Instead, it stretched into the longest conflict in U.S. history. Year after year, American troops patrolled mountains and deserts, fighting an enemy that faded into villages and returned again by night. Thousands of lives were lost. Trillions of dollars were spent. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, launching another costly and controversial war. Officials claimed Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, but none were found. As the conflict dragged on, insurgency, sectarian violence, and instability spread. At home, faith in government decisions fractured once again. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, born from the trauma of 9/11s, lasted 2 decades. By the time U.S. forces withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban had returned to power. Many asked what had been gained. The legacy of September 11th was more than war. It reshaped America itself, how it traveled, how it viewed security, and how it saw its place in the world. For a time, unity surged, flags waved, communities rallied, neighbors stood together. But as the years passed, unity faded, replaced by division over how America should act, who it should fight, and whether it was safer or weaker in a world forever changed. September 11th was not the end of America. But it was a reminder that collapse does not always come from external armies or great battles. Sometimes it comes from fear, from uncertainty, and from wounds that cannot be seen but are carried for generations. By the late summer of 1814, America had come dangerously close to losing its capital. The British, emboldened by their naval supremacy and fresh from victories in Europe, had devised a bold plan to march directly on Washington, D.C., the young nation's political heart. Few in the United States believed such a strike was possible. Washington was seen as a symbolic target, not a strategic one. Yet, that very symbolism made it an irresistible prize for the British. The defense of Washington fell to General William Winder, a man whose inexperience was as evident as his determination. Hastily assembling a ragtag force of regular soldiers, militiamen, and volunteers, Winder struggled to coordinate defenses against the far more seasoned British troops led by Major General Robert Ross. Many of the American units had never seen battle before. Morale was shaky, and discipline was uneven at best. On August 24, 1814, the two sides clashed at Bladensburg, Maryland. The battle that followed would later be remembered with bitter shame as one of the most humiliating defeats in American history. Despite outnumbering the British, the Americans broke under pressure. Units fled the field in panic, scattering before the steady advance of Ross's disciplined redcoats and the deadly volleys of British rockets. President James Madison himself had ridden out to witness the battle. But he and his cabinet were forced to retreat in the chaos. With the road now open, the British marched into Washington that evening. The city was eerily quiet, many residents having already fled. Then, with a sense of grim purpose, the invaders set fire to the public buildings. The Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House, then known as the President's Mansion, were engulfed in flames. The night sky glowed with the light of burning government institutions, while thick smoke billowed upward like a funeral shroud for Americans. The burning of Washington was not merely a military setback. It was a psychological catastrophe. The young republic had seen its very symbols of governance reduced to ash. Critics blamed Madison and his administration for the disaster, while whispers spread that the United States might never recover. To foreign observers, it seemed that America teetered on the brink of collapse. Yet, in the midst of despair, a flicker of resilience remained. Dolly Madison, the First Lady, had famously refused to leave the White House until the portrait of George Washington was secured, ensuring that the father of the nation's image would survive even as the building itself was consumed. And while Washington burned, the American spirit did not. Instead, the humiliation steeled many to fight harder, for surrender was now unthinkable. The British, however, did not stay. Having achieved their symbolic blow, they withdrew after only a short occupation. The fires still smoldered, but the capital was not permanently lost. What remained was the sobering realization that the war was far from over, that America had narrowly avoided total humiliation. Asterisk. Only a few days after the British had set Washington ablaze, their forces turned toward Baltimore, Maryland. The city had been a thorn in Britain's side for months due to its providers disrupting British shipping. But unlike Washington, Baltimore was prepared. Its defenders had learned from the chaos at Bladensburg and had fortified the city with earthworks, artillery, and a determined militia. At the head of the defense was Major George Armistead, commanding Fort McHenry at the entrance to Baltimore's harbor. As British warships approached, thousands of Americans stood ready to repel them. Bombardment began on the morning of September 13, 1814, and raged for 25 relentless hours. Rockets and cannonballs flew through the night sky, illuminating the fort with bursts of fire and smoke. Asterisk. Inside the fort, Armistead and his men endured the thunderous assault. Yet despite the heavy bombardment, the American defenders held firm. The fort's massive star-spangled banner flag, designed to be visible from a distance, waved defiantly throughout the attack. It became a symbol of resilience and unyielding national spirit, even as the enemy sought to destroy it. Watching from a nearby ship was Francis Scott Key, a lawyer and amateur poet who had been negotiating the release of American prisoners. Key's anxiety grew as the night stretched on. Would the fort survive? Would the American defenders hold? The answers came at dawn as the first light of September 14th touched the horizon. Key saw the enormous flag still flying above Fort McHenry. His heart soared. Against all odds, America had withstood the attack. It was a moment that captured the nation's ability to survive even when facing annihilation. The relief and pride were immense. The Republic had not fallen, and its spirit remained unbroken, moved by the scene. Francis Scott Key composed a poem that evening, "Oh Say Can You See," by the dawn's early light. That poem would later be set to music and eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. It immortalized the courage and tenacity of those who had held the line when America seemed on the edge of collapse. The successful defense of Baltimore did more than protect a city. It restored faith in the young nation. Following the burning of Washington, many feared America might crumble under foreign assault. But the stand at Fort McHenry proved that the Republic could endure. It was a reminder that even in the darkest hours, courage, unity, and determination could keep a nation from falling. By 1861, America faced its most profound existential crisis. The nation, barely a century old, was tearing itself apart from within. The issue of slavery had fractured the states, and compromise had failed. 11 Southern states seceded to form the Confederate States of America, challenging the very idea of a united republic. The Civil War was not simply a clash of armies, it was a battle for the soul of the nation. Millions of Americans wondered if the Union would survive or if the United States would split permanently, leaving two nations in its place. Families were divided. Brothers sometimes faced each other across the battlefield. The stakes could not have been higher. The collapse of the Republic loomed large. The turning point of this conflict came in July 1863, at the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had taken the audacious step of invading the North, hoping a decisive victory on Union soil would shift momentum in favor of the Confederacy. Over 3 harrowing days, the fields of Gettysburg became the bloodiest in American history. On the first day, Lee's forces pushed Union troops back through the town, gaining ground but facing fierce resistance. The second day saw brutal clashes. At Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield, where soldiers fought in hand-to-hand combat, under sweltering heat and relentless cannon fire. Morale and discipline were tested to the limit. Collapse seemed only a misstep away, a single failed maneuver from total disaster for the Union. On the third day, Lee attempted Pickett's charge, sending nearly 12,000 Confederate troops across open fields toward the Union center. The advance was decimated under withering artillery and rifle fire. Few made it to the Union lines. Gettysburg became a symbol of the Confederacy's overreach and the Union's resilience. Later that year, President Abraham Lincoln delivered his brief yet monumental Gettysburg Address, reframing the war as not only a struggle to preserve the Union, but a fight to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Though the war continued for nearly 2 more years, Gettysburg marked the turning point. The Confederacy, once advancing, now fought defensively. Union forces gained momentum, and the dream of permanent division faded. When General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, the Union survived. Yet the cost was staggering: more than 600,000 dead, countless wounded cities, and infrastructure destroyed. The Civil War was the closest the United States had ever come to true collapse, a period where the survival of the Republic itself was uncertain. At Gettysburg, the slaughtered fields and blood-soaked ridges, America had stood on the brink and emerged, bruised but unbroken. The nation had survived its ultimate internal test, proving that unity could endure even in the face of the most profound division. By the early 1940s, the United States had remained officially neutral while war raged across Europe and Asia, but neutrality could only last so long. On December 7, 1941, the world watched in horror as the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In just a few hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed. Battleships were sunk or damaged, and the Pacific Fleet was thrown into chaos. America had been struck at its heart, and the nation teetered on the edge of panic. Could the United States recover? Could it fight a global war on 2 fronts against both Japan in the Pacific and Germany in Europe? The sense of vulnerability was palpable. For the first time in generations, the mainland felt truly exposed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day with his famous words, "A date which will live in infamy." The attack unified the nation, turning isolationist sentiment into a collective determination to fight. The United States mobilized at unprecedented speed. Millions enlisted. Factories converted to war production, and entire cities became engines of war. The war was a test of endurance, innovation, and leadership. In Europe, the Allies fought a long and brutal campaign against Nazi Germany. In 1944, the D-Day invasion at Normandy demonstrated America's commitment to turning the tide. Soldiers stormed the beaches under relentless fire, facing near impossible odds. Success was not guaranteed, and failure could have prolonged the war indefinitely, risking the collapse of Allied efforts in Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American forces engaged in grueling, island-hopping campaigns. Battles like Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa tested the limits of courage and strategy. The war demanded total national effort, and every citizen, soldier, and factory worker felt the weight of survival on their shoulders. By 1945, the U.S. had brought the full weight of its industrial and military power to bear, ending the war. With Japan after the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, The victory ensured the survival of democratic nations and the United States' global leadership. But it came at a tremendous human cost. The nation had faced total global conflict and emerged. But the experience left deep scars. World War II was yet another moment when America stood on the brink. The possibility of defeat, of losing not just a war, but influence, security, and stability was real. Yet the resilience of its people, the strategic genius of its leaders, and the industrial might of the nation ensured survival. The Civil War had tested the United States internally. World War II tested it externally on a global stage. In both cases, the nation had faced collapse, had survived, forever changed but unbroken. After the end of World War II, the United States found itself in a new kind of war, one fought with conventional armies, but with ideologies, espionage, and nuclear threats. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was a period defined by tension, suspicion, and the constant possibility of total annihilation. The stakes could not have been higher. Both nations possessed nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over, and miscalculations could have led to catastrophic war. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought this danger into sharp focus. For 13 terrifying days, the world watched as American and Soviet leaders navigated a delicate balance between aggression and diplomacy. Any misstep could have triggered nuclear strikes that would have obliterated cities, economies, and millions of lives. President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a tense negotiation, each aware that the slightest error could trigger global disaster. The United States had deployed blockades, military alerts, and contingency plans, while the Soviet Union positioned missiles in Cuba just 90 miles from American shores. The possibility of collapse of the world succumbing to nuclear war felt closer than ever. Beyond missiles, the Cold War infiltrated daily life. Americans built fallout shelters, practiced duck-and-cover drills, and lived under the psychological weight of potential annihilation. Every international crisis from Berlin to Korea to Vietnam was seen through the lens of global survival. The nation's endurance was tested not only on battlefields abroad, but in the hearts and minds of its citizens at home. Despite the looming threat of collapse, America's institutions, economy, and diplomacy held firm. Leaders engaged in delicate diplomacy. Intelligence operatives gathered critical information, and ordinary citizens persevered under the shadow of unprecedented danger. In the end, careful negotiation, strategic patience, and the collective resilience of a nation prevented the Cold War from turning into a catastrophic nuclear conflict. The Cold War illustrated a chilling reality. America's survival was not guaranteed, even in a nuclear age. The nation had once again stood at the edge, this time facing the unimaginable power of modern technology and human error. Yet, like in the Civil War and World War II, the United States endured, learning lessons about diplomacy, vigilance, and the fragile nature of peace. Following the relative stability of the post-World War II era, the United States found itself embroiled in a new and complex conflict, the Vietnam War. Unlike previous wars fought on distant battlefields with clear fronts, Vietnam presented a murky challenger fight against guerrilla warfare, unfamiliar terrain, and a determined ideological enemy. The war began as part of America's broader strategy of containing communism. But as the conflict escalated, it became a test not only of military might, but of national endurance and morale. American soldiers faced brutal conditions, dense jungles, relentless ambushes, booby traps, and an enemy that blended seamlessly with the civilian population. On the home front, the war sowed division. Television brought graphic images of combat and casualties into American living rooms, creating a generation questioning the very purpose of the conflict. Anti-war protests spread across the nation, challenging government policy and the traditional sense of patriotic duty. The U.S., once seemingly invincible in global conflicts, now faced a crisis of identity and morale. The Tet Offensive of 1968 marked a turning point. Though militarily repelled, the surprise and scale of the attacks shocked the American public and media. Confidence in government statements about progress eroded, and the nation began to perceive the war as an unwinnable quagmire. The sense of America teetering on the edge was palpable not from foreign conquest, but from internal fracture and disillusionment. The Vietnam War forced the United States to confront limits of military power and exposed vulnerabilities in national unity. Soldiers fought courageously, yet the nation struggled to reconcile ideals of democracy with the realities of modern conflict. The war became a lesson in endurance, reflection, and the cost of overextension, both abroad and within the hearts of the American people. Despite the eventual withdrawal and the challenges to global influence, the nation survived. The Vietnam War underscored that America could endure both military setbacks and internal crises, but also highlighted that survival often comes at a profound human and societal cost. On the morning of September 11, 2001, America faced a new kind of threat: terrorism on its own soil. For coordinated attacks by the extremist group Al-Qaeda targeted iconic American symbols: the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and an intended target, thwarted by brave passengers on United Flight 93. The attacks were swift and devastating. Within hours, nearly 3,000 lives were lost, thousands more were injured, and the world watched in horror as smoke and debris filled the skyline of Manhattan. The psychological impact on the nation was profound. America's sense of security, long taken for granted, had been shattered. The events of 9/11 forced the United States to confront vulnerabilities in domestic security, intelligence, and emergency response. The attacks triggered a global response, leading to the War on Terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, and a fundamental shift in international relations. Citizens experienced a heightened sense of fear and unity simultaneously as communities rallied together to support victims and first responders beyond immediate destruction. 9/11 revealed the fragile balance of modern society. America's economy, infrastructure, and institutions had to adapt to a new reality, one where threats were no longer confined to distant battlefields, but could strike anywhere, anytime. The nation once again teetered on the edge of chaos, relying on resilience, quick action, and national solidarity to survive the aftermath. The legacy of 9/11 endures. It reshaped foreign policy, national security, and the collective consciousness of the American people. Yet, as with previous crises, the United States endured. The attacks tested the nation's resolve, unity, and principles, demonstrating that even in the face of unprecedented terror, the country could withstand shock, adapt, and rebuild stronger than before. In 2008, America faced a crisis unlike any in recent memory, not on a battlefield, but in the heart of its financial system. The collapse of major financial institutions, triggered by the housing bubble and risky lending practices, sent shockwaves through the global economy. Millions lost jobs, homes, and savings, and the nation teetered on the brink of a deep and prolonged depression. The crisis revealed vulnerabilities in regulation, banking practices, and consumer behavior. Iconic firms like Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, while others, including AIG and major banks, required massive government bailouts to survive. The American public, witnessing the fragility of institutions once considered unshakable, experienced a profound sense of uncertainty and fear. As the economy faltered, the human toll became painfully clear. Foreclosures skyrocketed, unemployment climbed, and communities struggled to maintain basic stability. Americans confronted harsh realities about debt, risk, and the consequences of unbridled speculation. The social fabric stretched thin, relied heavily on both local solidarity and federal intervention to prevent complete collapse. Government response, including the Troubled Asset Relief Program (TARP) and monetary stimulus measures, aimed to stabilize the system and restore confidence. Slowly, the economy began to recover, but the scars of the crisis remained visible for years. Public trust in financial institutions and policymakers was shaken, fostering a new era of scrutiny and regulatory reform. The 2008 financial crisis illustrated that America's strength lay not only in military power, but also in economic resilience and adaptability. It was a reminder that collapse could occur in unexpected ways, challenging the nation to rethink governance, oversight, and the balance between risk and responsibility. Despite the upheaval, the United States endured, learned, and eventually rebuilt another chapter in the story of a nation repeatedly pushed to its limits and yet surviving. In late 2019 and early 2020, a new threat emerged, not a foreign army, not an economic collapse, but a microscopic virus. COVID-19, the pandemic spread rapidly across the globe, reaching the United States and overwhelming healthcare systems, disrupting daily life and testing the nation's resilience, infrastructure, and social cohesion. Hospitals faced unprecedented strain as intensive care units filled and medical staff worked tirelessly under extreme conditions. Millions contracted the virus, and tragically, hundreds of thousands lost their lives. America's healthcare system, previously considered robust, revealed critical vulnerabilities in preparedness, supply chains, and public health communication. Lockdowns and social distancing measures altered daily life dramatically. Schools, businesses, and public spaces closed. Remote work and online learning became the norm. Americans were forced to confront isolation, uncertainty, and anxiety on a scale not seen in generations. Economic challenges mirrored the human toll. Unemployment spiked, industries collapsed, and government stimulus measures sought to prevent total economic breakdown. The pandemic also highlighted social inequalities and systemic weaknesses. Vulnerable populations, including low-income communities and minorities, faced higher rates of infection and mortality. The crisis sparked debates over healthcare policy, government responsibility, and the balance between personal freedoms and collective safety. Despite the devastation, America demonstrated resilience. Rapid development and distribution of vaccines, scientific innovation, and community support systems gradually brought hope. Citizens adapted to new norms, healthcare systems strengthened protocols, and society learned the importance of preparedness and solidarity in the face of invisible threats. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded Americans that crises are not only fought on battlefields or in boardrooms, they can strike from the microscopic realm, demanding courage, unity, and adaptability on a national scale. Once again, the nation teetered on the edge, yet endured, demonstrating a recurring theme in American history even when pushed to the brink. Survival and recovery remain possible. As we look back over centuries of trials, America's history is marked not just by victories, but by moments when the nation teetered on the brink. Civil wars, economic depressions, terrorist attacks, and pandemic siege left scars, reshaped society, and tested the very fabric of the country. Yet, through resilience, leadership, and the determination of everyday citizens, the United States endured. Each crisis reminded America of its vulnerabilities, but also its capacity to recover. The lessons are clear. Unity matters, vigilance is essential, and the courage of individuals can tip the balance between collapse and survival. These moments, though painful, define the nation's story, teaching generations that even on the edge, there is always hope. America may have stood on the edge of collapse many times, but it is this enduring spirit, this collective resilience, that has carried the nation forward and will continue to do so for generations to come.